What jolted Gladstone back to reality was the news from number 10 Downing Street. The Prime Minister, Lord Derby, had been forced to resign because of ill health. And the new Prime Minister, at the age of 64, was Benjamin Disraeli. It wasn't quite the way that Disraeli had hoped to make it to the top. But it was a moment of great joy for him and a remarkable achievement.
We mustn't forget at this stage where Disraeli has come from. For a Jewish man to become Prime Minister was something that was sensational, not just in Britain, but attracted comment, awe almost, throughout Europe. If we'd gone back to that dinner party in the 1830s when Gladstone and Disraeli met for the first time, Gladstone and probably even Disraeli would have been absolutely astonished if we'd told them then that Disraeli would be the first of the two to be Prime Minister.
Becoming Prime Minister was obviously the object of his ambition. What did he say? Was it, "I've reached the top of the greasy pole"? And so it was a huge achievement for him, considering what he'd been through, the kind of ridicule and defeat which he'd suffered and was soon to suffer again.
Disraeli's suffering resumed almost immediately for one simple reason. He and his party weren't really in control of the House of Commons.
The Conservatives were in a minority, so anything that the Tories wanted to do, the Liberals were able to vote down. Gladstone was merciless in the way that he taunted Disraeli on this. If Disraeli had made Gladstone's life an absolute misery during the Reform Bill, then Gladstone more than reciprocated once Disraeli became Prime Minister by making his life as difficult as he possibly could.
Hemmed in by Gladstone, Disraeli was Prime Minister in name only. Hugely frustrated by this, he called a general election after just 10 months in office. He hoped to increase his majority, but that's not what happened. A little ungratefully, perhaps, the working-class men to whom Disraeli had given the vote used their newfound power not to reward him, but to reward his arch-rival. When all the votes had been counted, it became clear that Gladstone, by now leader of the Liberal Party, was about to replace his old enemy at number 10. Gladstone was staying here at his country estate in North Wales when a messenger arrived from the Queen. What was Gladstone doing? Well, he was out in the ground somewhere, doing what he normally did, chopping down trees with great energy. The messenger told him that Victoria wanted to see him back in London to talk about forming a government. So Gladstone paused and said, "This is very significant." And he must have rattled the messenger because he then started chopping down more trees and went on for several minutes. And then he stopped and said, "My mission is to pacify Ireland." The fact that Ireland was in need of pacifying during the 1860s may come as a surprise to some people today, but that country was indeed a very troubled place at that time. The whole island, including the south, was ruled by Britain, and that was a big problem. Catholic indignation at Anglo-Protestant rule had to be assuaged, and Gladstone went out of his way to do that. Over the next 6 years, he and his ministers brought forward several pieces of legislation aimed at settling Irish grievances. And they also introduced many other reforms, ones which would make life better for the British people as a whole.
Gladstone's first administration really is the greatest of all his administrations. There's a real sense of energy and drive.
And it began what we now think of as mobility, what we now think of as meritocracy. Examination to enter the civil service rather than patronage, commissions in the army determined on ability rather than purchase, the ancient universities open to dissenters. He began to open up society.
Or think indeed of the great trade union legislation of 1871. Again, a landmark which, in one shape or other, shaped or informed the relationship and the nature of trade unionism in this country until the Tebet legislation over a century later, in 1982.
While Gladstone and his ministers pressed on with their reforms, Disraeli waited patiently, hoping they'd run out of steam. In April 1872, judging that they had, he launched a highly effective attack on them in a speech at Gladstone's old stomping ground, Manchester's Free Trade Hall. He delivered a witty speech in which he compared the members of Gladstone's cabinet to a range of extinct volcanoes. Widely hailed in the national press, the speech made it plain that Disraeli was back. A few months later, inside London's Crystal Palace, he turned the heat up even more by revealing his bold vision of what the Tory party's future direction ought to be. What Disraeli was trying to do was to drag the Conservative Party into a new era of democratic politics. That's what his Reform Act was all about, and that was the whole point of his great speech at Crystal Palace. The Tory party needed to change. Now, where have we heard that before? So top of the agenda from now on would have to be the condition of the people. In other words, the Tories needed to get serious about social reform. Concern about the living and working conditions of ordinary Britons had been apparent in many of the novels that Disraeli had written over the years. His decision to push the issue now, though, didn't stem solely or even mainly from a social conscience. Hard-headed political calculation was the main factor involved.
There is a new constituency out there that he has to appeal to, and that is the working classes. By making a pitch to them, he's saying the Conservative Party is not simply about the wealthy. The party has your interests at heart too. It's a sign of how acute he was about recognising the tide and the way in which things were moving.
Only Disraeli could see that the newly enfranchised urban poor could be induced to vote Conservative, and only he could make them do it.
And make them do it, he certainly did. Working-class voters defected to the Tories in droves at the election of 1874, propelling Disraeli into 10 Downing Street for the second time. The opportunity came at a difficult time for him. His wife had just died, plunging him into gloom. But he didn't let this put him off his stride. Over the next few years, with the help of his ministers, he introduced a wide range of timely and important reforms aimed at making life easier for working-class people.
There was a whole lot of social reforming legislation and huge advances in public health. Reforms which are now regarded as absolutely basic to ensure the fundamentals of life for people working in a mass production, industrialised, urban society. He didn't have a hands-on connection with it. I mean, it was his ministers who did it, but it was all in line with what he'd been saying. Even the origins of it could be found in his most famous novels.
Social reform was certainly at the heart of Disraeli's second administration. But it wasn't the only theme. He was also busy boosting the British Empire. He seized control of the Suez Canal from the French, and he cemented his famously good relationship with the Queen by giving Victoria the title of Queen Empress. So by the start of 1876, all of these combined to make Disraeli the clear favourite to win the next election. But in April of that year, something happened which changed the entire picture. The event in question was in fact a series of atrocities which occurred in a part of the far-flung Ottoman Empire. Centred on the Turkish city which we call Istanbul, that empire had spread out over the years to embrace a large part of North Africa and much of Eastern Europe. In April 1876, a nationalist revolt broke out in Bulgaria, one of the most volatile Ottoman territories. The empire's rulers responded by unleashing massive force. Thuggish, irregular troops, known as Bashi Bazouks, poured into the country, and there was an orgy of violence. some 15,000 people are thought to have been killed. When news of this reached Britain, Disraeli reacted in a way which left many of his admirers angry and confused. What Disraeli did was to misjudge the public mood and to misjudge it very badly. The newspaper reports about the Bulgarian atrocities had caused uproar here in Britain, and yet he dismissed them as coffeehouse gossip. He seemed to be questioning whether the atrocities had taken place at all. It was a monumental error and, of course, a gift to his main opponent. Gladstone had stepped down as leader of the Liberal Party by this stage and gone into semi-retirement. He decided to refrain from making grand public gestures. But Disraeli's response to the Bulgarian crisis changed all that.
Disraeli took the view, which cynical men have taken ever since and were taking before and will go on taking, that foreign policy was a matter of maximising Britain's national interests. Gladstone believed in moral foreign policy, a principled foreign policy, and therefore whether it was in our interest to support the Turks against the Greeks or the Greeks against the Turks didn't really matter to him. What mattered to him were the people he thought ought to be defended.
Equally appalled by what the Turks had done and by Disraeli's dismissive response, Gladstone wrote an angry pamphlet denouncing them and him with equal venom. Hugely influential at the time, it's widely seen today as one of the most effective political tracts any British politician has ever written. And this is it. It's called Bulgarian Horrors and the Question of the East. It's a pamphlet written in just 4 days by Gladstone in the summer of 1876. And it is a blistering attack, not just on the Turks, but on Disraeli. He mentions the massacre of women and children and then goes on to accuse Disraeli of lethargy and tardiness and inefficiency, and goes on to say this: silence was obtained and the well-oiled machinery of our luxurious, indifferent life worked smoothly on. It was published in early September. Within a month, it had sold 200,000 copies. It was a sensation. And as you can imagine, Disraeli wasn't exactly pleased. What Disraeli wanted, of course, was a chance to get even, and it soon came his way. In April 1877, war broke out in the Balkans. The Russians had used the Bulgarian atrocities as a pretext for invading Ottoman-controlled territory, something they'd been longing to do for years. The fighting went the Russians' way, and all of a sudden it looked as though the Ottoman Empire might actually collapse. The Russians, quite simply, had to be stopped, because if they managed to crush the Ottoman Empire, well, Britain's position in the world would be immeasurably damaged. So Disraeli now faced his greatest challenge on the world stage, and it came to a head here in Berlin in 1878. Disraeli had bullied and threatened the Russians into coming to the conference table, and what followed was one of the greatest diplomatic showdowns of the 19th century. Chosen because of its status as neutral territory at the heart of Europe, Berlin became the setting for what was, in effect, the first global summit. Known to historians as the Congress of Berlin, the summit determined the shape of Europe right up until the First World War. It was a glittering and high-powered affair attended by the representatives of many different countries. But there's no doubt at all about who was the most important person there. The great German diplomat, Prince Otto von Bismarck, gave the game away when he pointed across the room and said to an advisor, "Der alte Jude," the old Jew. He's the man. He was referring, of course, to Disraeli, who was 74, he was getting on a bit, but he was the central figure at this Congress. Everything revolved around him, and he protected Britain's interests at every turn. Disraeli was able to exert mastery over the Congress of Berlin, not only because he represented the world's most powerful empire, but also because he possessed a stunning array